My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 34 years old, and I've learned that in my family, whoever speaks the loudest is usually the one people believe. That night, we were all gathered at my parents' house. Nothing formal, nothing dramatic, just a familiar room filled with familiar faces. Then my sister-in-law stood up, raised her glass, and announced that she was flipping the family vacation house. She talked about renovations already in progress, about how the timing was perfect, about how easy the profit would be once it sold. My brother stood next to her, silent, nodding as if this was all settled business. My parents smiled, relieved that someone had finally taken charge of a place everyone else had stopped thinking about. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I didn't correct her. I just smiled. What no one in that room knew was that I had quietly bought that house years ago. There had been no family discussion, no group text, no celebration. Just contract signatures and a decision I made alone. The house wasn't neglected, and it certainly wasn't available for anyone else to flip. Still, I let her keep talking because, while she was outlining her plan, my phone was vibrating in my pocket. I hadn't looked yet, but I already knew it wasn't good. She didn't know the house was legally mine. She didn't know someone had been hired without my consent. And she definitely didn't know that the person doing the work was angry enough to demand answers. I stayed where I was listening as my family congratulated her for a deal she had no right to make, knowing that by the time the truth came out, it wouldn't be a simple misunderstanding. If you want to see what happens when confidence runs headfirst into paperwork and family loyalty collides with facts, make sure you're subscribed. This story doesn't end the way she thought it would. A few minutes later, I slipped into the kitchen, letting the voices from the living room fade into background noise, and that was when my phone rang with Brooke Adams's name on the screen. Brooke managed the cabin in Lake Arrowhead for me, and she wasn't the kind of person who called without a clear reason, so the moment I answered, I stopped moving and listened. She told me she'd just been by the property earlier than planned because a neighbor mentioned unfamiliar vehicles parked near the driveway, and what she found didn't match any routine visit. Someone had accessed the cabin using proper entry points, not by force, not by accident, but with the ease of people who believed they had permission to be there. She double-checked the maintenance calendar while we spoke, and confirmed there was no approved work scheduled, no inspection, no repairs of any kind authorized under my name. I asked her to walk me through exactly what she saw, not because I doubted her, but because my mind was already trying to frame the situation as a harmless mix-up. Brooke described tools stacked near the porch, interior lights on in the middle of the afternoon, and the unmistakable sound of work coming from inside, the kind that doesn't happen during a casual check-in. As she was talking, my phone vibrated again with an incoming email that had been forwarded from her account, and I opened it while keeping her on the line. It was a detailed invoice from a contractor, complete with dates, labor hours, materials, and a scope of work that went far beyond a minor fix. The address was correct. The unit description was accurate. The charges reflected a project that had already begun. I felt a quiet shift inside me as I scanned the numbers and realized there was no room here for confusion or coincidence. Brooke told me she hadn't spoken to the workers directly yet because she wanted to confirm with me first, and I thanked her for that, asking her to take photos, save access logs, and document everything she could without escalating the situation. When the call ended, I stayed where I was, holding my phone and rereading the invoice more carefully, line by line, noticing details that only made sense if someone had presented themselves as the decision-maker. I checked my own messages, my email history, my calendar, looking for any sign that I had delegated authority or approved work I couldn't remember. There was nothing. No request, no confirmation, no accidental oversight. The absence itself became the answer. This wasn't a contractor misunderstanding instructions or showing up at the wrong property. Someone had actively arranged this, provided access, and set expectations that implied ownership. I forwarded the invoice to a secure folder, noted the company name and contact information, and marked the start date that confirmed work had already been underway. Standing there, I felt the unease harden into certainty. If tools were inside the cabin, then keys had been shared or access codes given. If invoices existed, then agreements had been signed, and if none of it traced back to me, then whoever initiated this had done so knowing exactly what they were claiming to control. I sent Brooke a brief message asking her to pause any additional access to avoid confrontation and to keep me informed of any changes, then locked my phone and took a slow breath. When I walked back toward the living room, the conversation hadn't shifted. The laughter sounded the same, and no one noticed anything different about me, but the night had already changed. What had felt like a bold announcement minutes earlier now had weight behind it, the kind that comes with paperwork, invoices, and people acting as if decisions have already been made. It didn't take long for the uncertainty to harden into something measurable. I opened the access logs connected to the cabin and went through them one by one, watching timestamps stack up in a way that didn't belong to chance entries clustered during work hours, exits, late enough to suggest steady progress. Each record confirming that people were moving in and out with purpose. I compared those times against my own calendar and then checked the authorization list. The short, unchanged roster of names allowed access without prior notice, and there was no ambiguity there, either. No recent edits, no temporary permissions, no margin for misunderstanding. I called Brooke to confirm what I was seeing, and she answered without hesitation, telling me that no new access had been approved, and that the person claiming authority at the cabin had never been cleared to enter. That was the point where the situation stopped being a question and became a fact, because it meant the access wasn't borrowed or assumed it was granted under a claim that didn't exist. I asked Brooke to export the logs and monitor any further activity in real time. Then I pulled up the invoice again and dialed the contractor's number, expecting defensiveness, and getting something more: unsettling confidence. The man who answered identified himself as Andres Fuentes, professional direct, and when I asked about the project, he spoke as if everything were routine. He told me the work had already started, that his crew was following the agreed scope, and that they were moving forward on schedule. I told him calmly that I was the owner, not as a challenge, just as a correction, and the pause on the line was brief, but telling the sound of two versions of the same story colliding. He explained that he'd been hired by someone presenting themselves as the person in charge, that access had been provided, and that approvals were already in writing. I asked what would happen if that authority turned out to be false, and his answer carried weight, because it wasn't emotional, it was procedural. Unless he received formal instruction to stop, the work would continue under the terms of the contract, including the next phase that involved further removal. It wasn't a threat, just the reality of a business operating on signed agreements. I asked him to send me the contract and all related documentation, and he agreed, adding that interruptions mid-project created complications and costs that couldn't simply be undone. When the call ended, the shift was immediate and unmistakable. The problem no longer theoretical, but active, advancing whether I reacted or not. I lined up the access logs with the invoice dates and saw how cleanly they matched entries appearing just before labor charges began. Exits logged after the workday would reasonably end a timeline that left no room for coincidence. I organized the files, noted the start dates, and realized how quickly momentum builds once it's been set in motion, how easily paper authority can override actual ownership in practice. I messaged Brooke with clear instructions to observe without intervening, to document everything, and to alert me the moment access occurred again, because escalation without preparation would only complicate matters further. Standing there, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before: that ownership doesn't protect you in real time, only action does. Every hour that passed allowed someone else's decisions to reshape my property, and waiting even briefly would be interpreted as permission. The clock wasn't ticking loudly, it was ticking steadily, and for the first time I could feel the cost of every minute I didn't take back control. We met in a quiet, neutral place where neither of us would feel cornered, and the moment Andres Fuentes sat down across from me, I could tell he hadn't come to argue. He brought a thick folder, set it between us, and opened it without waiting to be asked, laying out the documents in an orderly stack that suggested preparation rather than panic. The first pages were the work authorization forms detailed and specific outlining interior removal, structural preparation, and a clear timeline that assumed full approval from someone with authority. My name wasn't on any of it. Andres explained how the job had been presented to him calmly and without drama, describing a client who said she was handling the property on behalf of the family and had the right to make decisions quickly. He pointed to a section where that claim was formalized in writing language, stating she was authorized to approve work coordinate access and move forward without delay. I asked what he had been told about the owner, and that was when the conversation crossed a line it couldn't come back from. He said he was told the owner was no longer reachable, that attempts to get direct confirmation had gone nowhere, and that waiting would only jeopardize the project. He added that the house was described as being on the verge of transfer, that paperwork was supposedly in motion, and that timing mattered if the property was going to be prepared for sale. None of it sounded improvised, and that was the detail that stayed with me because the explanation had structure, sequence, and intent. Andres slid forward an email thread showing how access had been arranged, references to keys, entry codes, and scheduling, all written in a tone that treated his involvement as expected, not conditional. I recognized the pattern immediately, not as confusion, but as a narrative designed to remove resistance, one that framed urgency as responsibility and silence as approval. I asked whether anything about it had raised concerns, and he answered honestly, saying the documentation matched the story he'd been given, that nothing appeared inconsistent, and that the presentation suggested coordination rather than conflict. When I told him I was the owner and that none of those claims were true, he didn't push back or defend himself. He listened. And that response confirmed something important, that he had been operating inside a version of events carefully constructed to appear legitimate. We went through the paperwork again, slower this time, and every detail sharpened the picture. The phrasing that implied group consensus, the casual dismissal of direct owner involvement, the repeated references to family decisions that supposedly justified moving ahead. This wasn't someone talking too much at a family gathering or stepping in to help without permission. It was a plan built to function even if questions were raised later. Andres acknowledged that if he had known the truth, the work would have stopped immediately, but the truth hadn't been part of what he was given, and that omission wasn't accidental. As I gathered the copies he provided, the shift inside me was precise and final. What I had hoped might be careless overconfidence revealed itself as deliberate misrepresentation. Authority claimed, in advance, obstacles removed on paper, momentum created to make stopping feel harder than continuing. By the time we stood up, the idea of this being a misunderstanding was gone entirely. What remained was a sequence of choices that pointed in one direction: access arranged, ownership obscured, urgency manufactured, all designed to move forward before anyone could slow it down. Walking away, I understood that this wasn't about correcting a mistake anymore. It was about confronting a plan that had been thought through well before the first tool ever touched my property. Later that night, when the house finally quieted, I asked Jason if we could talk alone, and he agreed immediately, which told me this wasn't a surprise conversation for him. We stood in a narrow space away from everyone else, close enough that the family noise still existed somewhere behind us, distant enough that it couldn't interfere. And I didn't start by explaining what I knew, because his expression already confirmed he understood why I was there. When I asked him directly how much he knew, he didn't deny anything. He said he knew enough to realize Kimberly was moving fast, that work had already begun, and that stopping it would create a mess that would be hard to control. He admitted he hadn't known every detail, but he knew the direction things were heading, and instead of questioning it, he chose to manage it. He told me he had advised her to finish quickly to keep it contained, to get through the process before it turned into something bigger than the family could handle. His words were careful, measured, framed in the language of practicality rather than morality, and when I asked why he never called me, he said he assumed the situation would resolve itself once ownership changed, that the conflict would disappear along with the paperwork. He didn't claim it was fair, and he didn't argue it was justified. He treated it like an inconvenience that needed to be minimized. Then he made his request not abruptly, but with a tone that suggested he believed it was reasonable. He asked me to stay quiet not because he wanted me to lie, but because he didn't want the situation to move outside the family. He said once lawyers, contractors, or anyone else got involved, there would be no way to control the outcome, and that silence was the only thing keeping it manageable. He was careful to draw a distinction he clearly found important. He wasn't asking me to say anything untrue. He was asking me not to say anything at all. In his mind, that difference mattered. Silence was restraint, not deception, and restraint was how families survived uncomfortable situations without destroying themselves. I didn't interrupt him or challenge his logic because I wanted to understand how he justified it to himself, and he continued explaining that sometimes protecting people meant preventing consequences rather than confronting them. He said he believed that once everything was finished, the issue would simply fade, that the work would be done, the sale would move forward, and no one would have to deal with the fallout. He didn't promise it would feel right, only that it would be over. I asked him what he expected from me beyond silence, and he said nothing else. Just time, just restraint, just the choice not to interfere while things were still technically fixable. What struck me most wasn't what he said, but what he didn't say. He never claimed Kimberly had done nothing wrong, and he never claimed I was mistaken. He only argued that speaking up would make things worse. He framed inaction as neutral, as if choosing not to act carried no weight of its own, and that framing was the core of what he was asking me to accept. I listened until he finished, noticing how often he used words like contained, controlled, and internal, as if the scale of the problem depended entirely on who was allowed to know about it. I didn't tell him what I thought or what I planned to do, because the conversation wasn't about persuading him or being persuaded. It was about acknowledging the choice he was placing in front of me. He wasn't demanding loyalty or threatening consequences. He was asking for cooperation rooted in family logic, the kind that assumes silence is kindness and exposure is harm. When the conversation ended, nothing outwardly dramatic happened. We simply walked back toward the rest of the house, and anyone watching would have assumed everything was fine. Inside, though, I understood the line that had just been drawn, not between right and wrong, but between speaking and staying silent, and I knew that whichever side of that line I chose would define what came next, far more than any argument ever could. The shift happened quietly, without raised voices or dramatic confrontations, and that was what made it irreversible. The first move arrived in writing a formal notice sent by Ryan Choi, the attorney I had retained, drafted in clear language that didn't argue or threaten, but simply stated facts, ownership, unauthorized activity, and an immediate demand to stop all work and communication related to the property. There was no room left for interpretation, no suggestion that the situation could be smoothed over or delayed. Not long after, I received a call from Linda Pearson, an investigator assigned to review irregularities tied to financial representations connected to the property, and her tone was calm, procedural, and detached. She didn't ask emotional questions or speculate about intent. She focused on documents, timelines, and claims that didn't align, explaining only that certain inconsistencies had triggered a formal review and that further actions would follow established process. While those steps moved forward without noise, Kimberly called me, and the contrast between what was happening and what she believed was striking. She sounded confident, even upbeat, as if the worst part was already behind her, explaining that once the sale closed, Everything would resolve itself, that the numbers would cover the gaps, and that any tension would disappear as soon as the transaction was complete. She blamed the contractor for escalating costs and miscommunication, insisting that the situation had grown more complicated than she intended, but was still manageable. She spoke about timing and momentum, about how close everything was to being finished, and she treated outside involvement as an unnecessary risk that could ruin an otherwise simple outcome. I let her talk, noticing how she equated progress with legitimacy, as if work already done could justify authority she never had. She never asked whether she might be wrong. She assumed the end result would erase the path taken to get there. While she was explaining how she planned to fix everything, confirmation arrived that made her confidence meaningless. A legal acknowledgement was issued validating the cease action, and with it came an enforcement step that changed the situation instantly. Access to the property was formally restricted, permissions revoked, and any further activity frozen without exception. Entry codes were invalidated, access logs locked, and the systems she had relied on to keep things moving were shut down in a matter of moments. When she realized what had happened, the shift in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. The certainty that had anchored her arguments vanished, replaced by questions that no longer carried authority. She asked what this meant for the sale, for the work, for the timeline she had been counting on, and for the first time she wasn't describing outcomes, she was waiting to hear them. I didn't explain the legal mechanics or outline consequences, because at that point, explanation wasn't necessary. The situation had moved beyond persuasion and into enforcement, and her version of events no longer mattered. The ability to redirect blame, to push forward quickly, or to rely on completion as protection had ended the moment control was removed from her hands. What stood out most was how dependent her confidence had been on uninterrupted motion, how quickly certainty collapsed once momentum stopped. Without access, there was nothing left to leverage, no shortcut to force resolution, no authority to claim, while hoping facts would catch up later. The reversal wasn't loud or public. It didn't come with accusations or spectacle. It arrived through documentation and confirmation, and it was final in its effect. She didn't lose control because someone confronted her directly. She lost it because the system she was trying to outrun finally closed the door. When the call ended, there was no argument left to revisit, and no promise that things could still be handled quietly, only a clear separation between what she believed could still happen and what was now officially impossible. The hope she had been operating under didn't collapse in a dramatic moment, it dissolved the instant the process stopped recognizing her authority, and from that point on, there was no path left for her to maneuver. When everyone was finally in the same room, I didn't wait for a pause or ask for space. I simply set the folder on the table and opened it, letting the action speak before I said anything at all. I started with the deed, placing it where everyone could see my name clearly printed, then slid forward the supporting ownership records that confirmed the timeline and left no ambiguity about when the property had changed hands. I didn't explain how I got it or why I never announced it, because none of that mattered anymore. Next came the emails printed and highlighted showing how access had been requested, approved, and coordinated by someone who did not own the house, followed by the key access logs, time-stamped entries that lined up cleanly with the construction schedule. I added the contractor's file, last the signed authorization, the scope of work, the communications that showed how authority had been claimed, repeated, and relied on. I spoke only enough to identify what each document was, nothing more, letting the sequence build its own meaning. The room stayed quiet, not confused, but heavy, the kind of silence that settles in when explanations stop being possible. Jason didn't try to interrupt or redirect, and when someone asked him whether he had known, he didn't hedge or deflect. He admitted that he had been aware things were moving forward, that work had begun, and that instead of stopping it, he had chosen to let it continue. He didn't argue with the documents or suggest they were incomplete, and that acceptance removed the last space where denial might have lived. Kimberly tried to speak, but what came out were partial thoughts that never connected, explanations that couldn't survive the paper in front of her, and within moments, she stopped altogether. The confidence she had once carried into family conversations didn't crack loudly, it simply disappeared, leaving nothing behind to replace it. I didn't accuse her or describe motives because intention was irrelevant. Now the record was complete on its own. One by one, the assumptions that had protected her standing dissolved, not because anyone attacked her, but because the facts made it impossible to keep pretending there was another version of events. No one raised their voice. No one stood up dramatically. The confrontation unfolded in stillness, in the quiet understanding that this was no longer a misunderstanding. At some point, a single comment cut through the silence said evenly and without anger that this could have been handled more discreetly. The sentence wasn't aimed at me or anyone else in particular. It was an expression of discomfort, a wish that the truth might have taken up less space once it was impossible to ignore. I didn't respond to it, not because I didn't hear it, but because answering would have shifted the focus away from what had already been established. The family sat with the discomfort instead, eyes moving between the documents and each other, and no one offered an alternative explanation that fit what was on the table. Kimberly said nothing more, and Jason didn't attempt to soften what he had acknowledged. When it was clear there were no questions left that could change the facts, I closed the folder and pulled it back toward me, not as a gesture of control, but of finality. The moment didn't end with resolution or agreement, it ended with awareness, the kind that lingers because it can't be undone. I didn't tell anyone what to think or how to respond, because the truth didn't need instruction, and whatever reactions followed would belong to them, not to me. As the room slowly shifted, conversations restarting in fragments, it became clear that the unease wasn't caused by the exposure itself, but by the realization that silence had been an option for some, and transparency had never been convenient. That realization stayed suspended between us, unresolved, not because it lacked an answer, but because answering it would require admitting how much easier it had been to look away. What followed didn't come with drama or sudden explosions. It arrived through paperwork, deadlines, and consequences that didn't ask for anyone's feelings. Legal notices turned into financial obligations, then into restrictions that tightened one by one, and Kimberly's situation shifted from something she thought could be fixed quickly into something she could no longer control at all. Reviews were opened, representations were questioned, and the version of events she had relied on stopped mattering once everything moved fully into documented process. Her confidence didn't collapse publicly, it faded privately, replaced by delays, unanswered calls, and decisions made without her input. I changed the locks on the property the same day the access restriction was confirmed, not to make a point, but to close a chapter. Codes were reset, permissions revoked, and every point of entry returned to a single name, mine. I ended all direct contact immediately, no texts, no calls, no explanations, and from that moment on, every communication went through my attorney. It wasn't an emotional decision, it was a structural one designed to remove ambiguity and prevent the kind of informal pressure that had allowed things to escalate in the first place. Messages still came filtered through other people suggesting we should talk, that this had gone far enough that there had been misunderstandings on all sides. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't correct assumptions or restate facts because engaging would have reopened a discussion that was already settled. The tone of those messages shifted over time from practical to conciliatory, then to concerned, as if persistence might soften a boundary that had already hardened. It didn't. The family suggested meeting again, saying that now everything was clear. It might help to sit down and talk it through to bring things back into the family where they belonged. I declined once clearly and without explanation, and when the suggestion came again, I declined the same way. I didn't justify my choice or outline conditions under which I would reconsider, because there were none. Kimberly stopped trying to reach me once it became obvious that nothing would be handled privately anymore, and Jason didn't push after the first refusal. The distance that followed wasn't hostile, it was final, a clean separation where roles were defined by law rather than expectation. What remained was quieter than everything that came before. Ownership restored, access controlled, responsibility clearly assigned, and no lingering negotiations disguised as conversations. I didn't wait for apologies or look for closure in words, because the outcome didn't require them. The situation resolved itself through systems that kept moving long after personal contact ended, through boundaries that didn't need agreement to hold. There was no reconciliation, no moment where everyone felt satisfied with how things turned out, and I didn't need one. Ending contact completely was the conclusion, not because it felt dramatic or empowering, but because it removed the last point of confusion. I moved forward without revisiting what had already been decided, understanding that clarity doesn't come from repeated discussion, it comes from final decisions. The silence that followed wasn't the silence I had been asked for before, the one meant to protect someone else's comfort. This one was deliberate and owned. It wasn't temporary or strategic, it was permanent, and it marked the end of a story that didn't need forgiveness to be finished, only distance and the refusal to turn back. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.